Hi, everyone, and welcome to this event hosted by the Emergent Nonfiction Lab. This research lab critically examines emerging media technologies and their roles in contemporary forms of statecraft, including regimes of surveillance, technocratic warfare, and other forms of violent governmentality. We aim to highlight how these modern media regimes are deeply rooted in historical modes of colonial, racial, and imperial violence. The lab also seeks to explore new and counter-hegemonic practices that challenge and subvert these dominant modalities. Through talks, workshops, and seminars, we aim to engage with alternative forms of media practice that push back against these modes of technological violence, advocating for resistant methodologies and practices. So, our discussion today, titled Israel and the AI driven military industrial complex, brings together two exemplary speakers to examine the ways in which artificial intelligence and other network centric technologies fit into the longer history of Israel's military industrial complex and its regimes of surveillance and control in the occupied Palestinian territories. As Israel aims to become a leader in high tech military technoscience, including in AI enabled warfare, we need to understand these developments in a broader context. The discussion will focus on systems like Gospel and Lavender, examining whether these systems represent a deepening of the militaristic-capitalistic project of AI or are simply technological extensions of Israel's military strategy, or perhaps both. So I'll introduce both of our speakers now, and they'll each speak for around 20 to 25 minutes before we open up to a broader discussion. So Jeff Halper is an anthropologist, activist, and head of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. He is the author of War Against the People, Israel, the Palestinians, and Global Pacification from Pluto in 2015, which examines the role of Israel's military-industrial complex in the generation of a, quote, global pacification industry, end quote. Lucy Suchman is Professor Emerita of Anthropology of Science and Technology in the Department of Sociology at Lancaster University. Her current research extends her long-standing critical engagement with the fields of artificial intelligence and human-computer interaction to the domain of contemporary militarism. So with that, I'll hand over to Jeff for around 20 to 25 minutes, and then we'll hear from Lucy after that. So Jeff, over to you.
Okay, thank you for that, Patrick. I'm very happy to be with you all tonight, and especially happy to be together with Lucy, a fellow anthropologist, sort of, or in the realm at least, to talk about what's really, of course, a very important subject, but one that really needs much more discussion on the left, certainly. I wrote this book, War Against the People, which is a subject I know nothing about. I couldn't have told you the difference between a tank and a pistol. It's not my field. I really didn't know, but I've always been politically active on the Palestine issue, of course, but on wider global issues. And so, as I was kind of tracing out the threads of Israel's involvement, what we're going to talk about tonight, how it's really exporting its population control techniques over the Palestinians, its security-based state abroad, because Israel's exports isn't only weapon systems and technologies and tactics of population control, but actually a whole concept of a security state that it's exporting everywhere. As I was tracing that out, I really began to understand that how much I didn't understand about what I was really trying to trace out. In other words, the military-industrial complex is a multi-trillion-dollar industry. The Pentagon's budget itself is $1 trillion a year, and yet I knew nothing about it. Here I am, a political activist, professor of anthropology, very active in one of the major conflicts of the world, writing about global Palestine. And yet here's a huge industry. I mean, this is not just an industry. This is, of course, an extension of the neoliberal system that, as I'll say in a minute, is intent on pacifying us. as consumers and to neutralize us as possible counter neoliberal actors. So it's a very important kind of a part of the world that we live in, and yet I knew nothing about it. I knew nothing about weapon systems, nothing about military applications, certainly of AI. But what are surveillance systems? What's the relationship between the military and police and security? The military technologies, of course, but the grander strategies of militaries, centric warfare, for example, strategies, the use of technologies, and their applications in terms of how they're affecting people. All these were questions that I really had no idea about. And I said to myself, whoa, this is a huge blind spot, not only in terms of my own self, which I'll begin with, but also in terms of the left, I think. Because, this is kind of pop analysis, but, most of us, I would say on the left or that are more progressive, probably come, I know this is a tremendous generalization, but overall, most of us come from the social sciences or the humanities. Not that many of us, I would say proportionally, come from the hard sciences. And so, we tend to look at the world, we have our analyses and so on, but, it's like C.P. Snow's two cultures. We really don't know the world of technology, and certainly of military technology. And that, I think, is a blind spot that really we have to begin to address. And so I wrote this book, War Against the People, for two reasons. First of all, to ask, how does Israel get away with what it's getting away with? And so I traced Israel's involvement in what I call the global pacification industry. But beyond that, and actually towards the middle of the book, which is kind of unreadable to some degree, I really try to get into military technologies, especially those of Israel, not to bore my readers so much, but to familiarize ourselves with that vocabulary, control and command systems and network-centric warfare, and all the kinds of, I took the book's title, War Against the People, from a general, Smith, Rupert Smith, who has a very influential book called War Amongst the People, in which he really tries to get at how war, not from our point of view politically, but from a military point of view, how war is really geared towards fighting amongst the people, because conventional warfare is not the main source of warfare today. So I think that that's why this discussion is important, because we on the left, even before we begin to develop, as Patrick says, counter-resistance kinds of, or resistance kinds of plans and strategies and actions and so on, we really have to know what we're up against. And I think this is a whole area, and I think Lucy is much better positioned to tell us the more technical details than I am, certainly. But this was my intent, was to try to alert the left towards this phenomenon that we have to address. So what I'd like to do is kind of give a broader political context to what we're talking about, and then pass it on to Lucy to really fill in the very important, obviously, technical AI, technological details and how it works, and then we can open more for discussion. So I want to just start with a couple slides. Because in a sense, we're talking in a way, if we talk about AI, about applications. Now, applications is a very neutral sort of a term. I mean, an application can be a good thing or a bad thing. It depends on who's planning the algorithm, what the context is, what the goals are of whoever is activating these kinds of systems. For example, in police work, where AI is becoming very, very and even scarily active in terms of predictive crime. AI obviously could be used in a very efficient way. It collects massive amounts of data It can target populations. It can find individual people in a tremendously short period of time, which is maybe a good thing if you're a policeman. But the question is, who are we looking for? What are the crimes? Are we targeting particular populations? And if we look at pacification from the point of view of global neoliberalism, then we become the targets. We're the criminal. Who defines what a criminal is? You see, and that is built into the algorithms. So we can't fault in some ways the technology itself, but without a context to how it's being used and who's using it and to what purposes, it's very hard for us to evaluate what's happening. So let me just take the little time I have and kind of set out this broader political context to this that Lucy can then detail much more. So the purpose of war, as you can see on this slide, is pacification. I mean, there's all kinds of wars, obviously, but I'm talking really about a war in a more of a global sense. I'll come back to that in a second, but well, okay. We're living in, and I don't want to get into depth because we all know this part of it so much, but we're living in a world that in many ways is suffering from chronic insecurity, the deprivations of depredations of global neoliberalism in terms of income inequalities, climate change, the resource wars that are happening, all within again a capitalist neoliberal framework, and the technologies of repression that then come in order to enforce this kind of a system, and there's a concept that I think should be at the forefront of our attention in terms of political activists on a global level, and that's this idea of surplus humanity. We live in a world in which literally 1% of the population controls about 50% of the world's wealth, and neoliberalism, as we know, is profit driven, and it's so what's happening as the neoliberalism develops is that more and more people are being excluded from the global system. 80% of the world's population lives on less than $10 a day. So this is an issue for the global South, of course, that has never been able to penetrate the institutions and the markets of the global North and to control its own resources. But at the same time, this is an issue for the young people, especially from the global North, who are finding themselves excluded from the job market. This young generation today, some of you are listening to this, will have less life opportunities than your parents did. And so in this kind of a world system that's closing down, in terms of the income disparities, in terms of the possibility of entering a job market and having any kind of life security, in terms of climate change, in terms of all the insecurities, that we have in the world, that in a way has depoliticized young people, because in a way, the system, I think, intentionally creates such insecurity that people simply don't have the mental space to get on with politics. They have to deal with themselves. So neoliberalism focuses everything on you, both as a consumer, but also as an individual who's insecure, that has to simply spend most of your time worrying about yourself and not about other people. So in that kind of what I call a catastrophic convergence of all of these things, that's where war against the people comes in. Because until, let's say the mid-1970s even, when neoliberalism really got to start with Reagan, capitalism had kind of a friendly face. Ronald McDonald and Disney films and all of that. But as it's closed down in all these ways, and as it's been seen to be planetarily catastrophic, this whole neoliberal capitalist system, and more people are excluded, it's had to become more and more repressive. Because you can't exclude not only the global South, but whole generations of middle-class people and working people in the global North, and not expect some kind of pushback, some kind of resistance, rebellions, protests, that take all kinds of forms. Unfortunately, one of the problems is we're not very well organized on the left. But all these expressions pour out. Maybe the most pointed was the Occupy movement of 10 years ago or so. At any rate, populations are restive. And therefore, the capitalist system has gone from persuading people to be a part of it because they can have a better life to more and more repression. Now, in this kind of a system, we all become then the enemies, and there's all kinds, so that, again, the question I asked before, who is the criminal or who is the enemy in military terms, does not break down as it used to an enemy that's clearly identified being on the other side in a war, but the enemy is within. There's a whole concept of the universal adversary in war, but this is a war on the people, and so the people that have to be pacified, that have to be conform to this neoliberal system, in which, again, the flow of resources is flowing to a small percentage of humanity. That makes the people the enemies, and we have all these kinds of terms that we use and target populations that we use. Now, the Pentagon and European ministries of defense, and Russian and Chinese too, for that matter, the major powers are geared towards conventional interstate wars. Those are the kinds of wars that you develop F-35s for, and nuclear submarines, and all kinds of military systems for fighting an enemy, especially a major enemy. But there hasn't been, if you look at a conventional war that's involved two or more major world powers, there has not been a conventional war since World War II. Or actually, I mean, you might put in Korea as well. In other words, we've had wars. We have wars with, Russia, Ukraine today, the Arab-Israeli wars, as they're called, the Iran-Iraq wars. There's been other wars in the world, of course, but they have not involved, they haven't been conventional wars. They've been more what we call asymmetrical wars, of either a major power against a minor power, or a state power against a non-state actor. So that wars today, those kinds of weapon systems don't really reflect warfare today, the wars against the people. Those are instead what we would call securocratic wars. Wars to securitize our lives, and to securitize, certainly to securitize the wealthy, Fortress America, Fortress Europe, and so on, but to create a situation in which we even securitize ourselves. We live in a security state. And these kinds of wars against the people take two kind of interlocking forms. One is more military, as you can see in the center of the screen, more asymmetric military wars abroad, but then they shade into asymmetric wars of militarized police and security forces at home. So there begins to be this, there used to be, even in American law, there still is, and in Europe in general, you've always had a wall between the domestic and the foreign, between the police and the military, between, let's say, the FBI and the CIA. That all broke down, especially with 9/11. But certainly it broke down with the logic of neoliberalism, in which the real enemies of the elites of the world are us, and not some enemy, abroad somewhere. And so here you have a whole kind of, you can see in these colored circles, different kinds of interlocking forms of warfare. But what unites them is, whether they're military abroad or militarized at home, what unites them all is that they're wars against the people. And so you go from high intensity operations. Today, wars aren't even called wars. I mean, the United States war in Iraq was Operation Desert Storm with other operational names. Israel's now fighting Operation Iron Swords. In other words, we're not even talking about wars, but about operations, partly because that allows states to avoid international law and laws of war. But also, I think it reflects something, that these aren't wars in that conventional sense. These are operations. These are counterinsurgency, irregular kinds of warfare operations, moving into homeland security and policing. So that this reflects what I've been saying about wars against the people. And in wars against the people, Israel plays a key role. Because Israel has had the laboratory of the Palestinians, even from before 1968. Israel's been in a war against the Palestinian people for the past century, more than a century, in fact. And genocide is built into settler colonialism. Zionism had to be genocidal. No matter how liberal the Zionists like Ben-Gurion thought they were, it had to be genocidal, because you cannot take the land of another people and you cannot fulfill Zionism's express goal, which was to transform an Arab country into a Jewish country, without genocide. You can't replace one country with another, one people with another, one infrastructure and set of cities and towns and a geography, one with the other, without genocide. And that's become a war against the people. That's continuing, with a vengeance today in Gaza, but also in the West Bank. And here's where Israel has this niche, because, like I said before, the Pentagon and the major defense ministries of and industries of the major powers are all geared towards conventional warfare. Israel does have that capability. That's why it has this, what I call this pivotal position. It is capable of fighting conventional wars. I mean, it's itching to fight a war with Iran. It's fought wars with Egypt and Syria and the Arab states around. It's participated in other wars with the United States and other powers. It's capable. It has very high-tech weapon systems, and it has a capacity to integrate high-tech systems like F-35s and like nuclear weapons and nuclear submarines and all of that into its arsenal. So it has that capability. But at the same time, the weapons it really develops, what it really focuses on, are the weapon systems and the tactics of population control and surveillance that have to do with controlling the Palestinian population, the West Bank and Gaza in particular. And it's not the Palestinians that are any kind of existential threat to Israel, of course. Palestinians don't represent any real threat to Israel. Israel could easily contain them. But on purpose, Israel keeps a kind of a low-intensity warfare going in the occupied territories because it's a laboratory. And what country has 5 million people that it can experiment on in terms of hundreds of checkpoints, where your security companies and your surveillance companies like NSO, with its Pegasus program and so on, can actually experiment with their sensors and their biometric devices and other technologies on actual people, and with no oversight whatsoever. Look, Israel is able to conduct this whole war in Gaza without any sanctions whatsoever, so that it has this laboratory And it keeps it on a low intensity level because that's how you activate the laboratory. You have to be able to use your weapon systems in actual situations, but once in a while, it does allow this low intensity conflict to blow up into something bigger like today, or the last 4 assaults on Gaza that have happened over the last 15, 16 years. It does that because there are some weapon systems that you want to test that go beyond simple population control, artillery and drones and different kinds of aircraft and surveillance systems and satellite systems and so on. Your Navy and so on, you can't really test those kinds of systems on a few Palestinians going through a checkpoint in Bethlehem. So you have to have a higher intensity conflict at times, which also gives an opportunity to the different powers to come in and observe how you're conducting this sort of a warfare so they can take lessons back and buy your weaponry. The point I'm making here is that the target of Israel's military-industrial complex is not the Palestinians. These are not wars for survival or even wars for security for Israel, like it presents it. These are wars that are manufactured and kept going but a war against the people, so that the end users are the peoples of the world. In other words, Israel is then exporting the weapon systems, surveillance systems, and again, tactics of population control everywhere in the world, from the United States and Europe, of course. For example, the Watchkeeper drone, which is the drone that's being developed as the EU weaponized drone, is 51% owned by Israeli Elbit Systems. But at the same time, its repressive technologies on the Palestinians is tremendously useful for oppressive countries all over the world, even countries that have no relations to Israel, like Saudi Arabia, for example. So that all the systems that Israel develops on the Palestinians have tremendous markets abroad, and this is Israel's niche. And I'll end on this. I think I had more, but Israel's niche is that, again, in this neoliberal system, where a few elite, are controlling the resources of the world more and more and more, actually, and more people are being excluded from the system. In order to keep control, to keep economic control, political control, and military security control over this, what many of us would say is an unsustainable system, it needs not the conventional weapons of conventional warfare, but it needs the kinds of weaponry, the kinds of tactics, the kinds of surveillance devices that Israel has developed in its Palestinian laboratory on the Palestinians. So that's Israel's niche. Its niche in this neoliberal world is war against the people, which spans everything from militaries that are fighting against insurgents wherever they are, or rebels, or revolutionaries, as we used to call ourselves, down to urban populations, people like us, the Occupy movement, in terms not only of spying and of surveillance, where AI plays a great role, but in terms of predictive analytics that let the system even predict where the next protest is coming from, who's going to lead them. And so you need this kind of a political context in order to understand how these systems that Lucy's going to talk about, AI systems and other high-tech systems, are actually being used, in my view. And so hopefully I did that. Maybe not well, but I provided that context, and now I'll let Lucy take over.
Thanks so much, Jeff. Yeah, if you could just stop sharing your screen, and then we'll pass over to Lucy. Let me just. Okay. Go ahead, Lucy.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Patrick. And it's really an honor for me to be in conversation with Jeff around this really extraordinary book, War Against the People. And in the book, Jeff sets out, as he says, what he sums up as a global matrix of control. And for those of you, it's a very large book, but I would particularly recommend for those of you interested more specifically in Israel, chapter 7 of the book, which really brings that analysis to bear on the arrangements with the Israeli, more specifically within the Israeli security complex. But the book, for me, really provides essential context for my own project of tracking developments in the United States, military, industrial, I would say also commercial complex. And I do that, I hope, as a contribution to wider collective movements for anti-militarism and demilitarization. So Jeff's book helps us to locate what's happening currently within a longer history of interconnections between militaries, border control, and policing operations. Things, as Jeff said, that we've been taught to think of as separate, but as I think he shows in a really compelling way, and others have also argued, are part of a wider systemic set of relations. And the United States, which is my country of citizenship, and Israel are deeply invested in both senses of that word, deeply invested in that securitization complex. So turning more specifically to what I would call data-driven warfighting in Israel-Gaza, Jeff also sets out in detail how Israel has positioned itself as a major exporter, not only of arms for warfighting, but also border enforcement, surveillance, and policing. So Plus 972 magazine reports that in 2023, Israel's defense exports reached a record 13 billion US dollars. And as Jeff argues, the occupation is a resource for this, serving as what Anthony Lowenstein in his recent book also names the Palestine Laboratory. But Jeff really called this out almost a decade ago now when he wrote in his 2015 book, War Against the People. I'm just going to read a quote here. Quote, "The occupied Palestinian territory has been transformed into probably the most monitored, controlled, and militarized place on earth. It epitomizes the dream of every general, security expert, and police officer to be able to exercise total biopolitical control." And this is an aside from me, but I would emphasize that word dream, because in many cases, when we are talking about these military aspirations, they are aspirations. They are even in many ways fantastic, but they are incredibly important and have real material consequences. So going back to the quote, Jeff writes, "It epitomizes the dream of every general, security expert, and police officer to be able to exercise total biopolitical control. In a situation where the local population enjoys no effective legal protections or privacy, they and their lands become a laboratory where the latest technologies of surveillance, control, and suppression are perfected and showcased, giving Israel an edge in the highly competitive global market. Labels such as, quotes, combat proven, tested in Gaza, and approved by the IDF on Israeli or foreign products greatly improves their marketability." End of that quote. And so Israel benefits from the occupation as well, insofar as threats from the occupied territories justify the provision of arms to Israel from its allies. According to SIPRI, that's the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, 69% of Israel's weapon imports come from the United States, the remainder largely from Germany. And the US arms industry, as Jeff observes, is the strongest special interest, pressing for US support of the Israeli government. It's in the domain of vested interests that sustain technologically based security politics that Jeff's path and my own intersect most directly. Unlike Jeff, I'm engaged with these developments in Israel and Gaza at a distance from my home in Canada. As an anthropologist like Jeff, I recognize the serious limitations this places on my knowledge of life on the ground in Israel-Palestine. And yet, as a Jewish American, I see myself as deeply implicated in both Israeli and US militarism. So for me, coming of age as a student in the late 1960s and 70s at the University of California at Berkeley during the horrors of the US assault on Vietnam, my own studies followed the call to bring anthropology home to look at the everyday life of US militarism, settler colonialism, corporate power. And that brought me through a series of circumstances to do my dissertation fieldwork at Xerox's Palo Alto Research Center, a very famous site in the development of computing, particularly during the 1970s. And I then went on to work there as a researcher for 20 years. And it's there that I began my critical engagement with the project of AI, which is focused now on that project's contribution to the perpetuation of militarism, digital dehumanization, and the acceleration of mass killing, which is epitomized by IDF operations in Palestine. So before I turn to those specifics, I think in understanding Israel's technologies for automated targeting, which has been the focus, it's important to begin with the mystifying effects of the term AI, which might better be expanded as algorithmic intensification. Current applications of so-called machine learning and targeting are the latest in a continuing history of the automation of weapon systems. And as always, it's humans who are responsible, however much automated systems complicate that and offer cover for the avoidance of accountability. So if we're talking about data-driven targeting, then we need to start, I would argue, with data. In military discourses and media reports derived from them, data they're naturalized, they're treated as objectively given signals that are emitted by the world. But this glosses over a myriad of questions, including what's actually detectable through technologies of surveillance and what isn't, what escapes them, and how machine-readable signals, and where the machine-readable is key here, how those signals get translated into so-called actionable intelligence for the military. In the occupied territories, surveillance includes massive amounts of aerial imagery, from satellites to drones, cell phone signals, which are taken as proxies for location and for movement, biometric registration at hundreds of checkpoints, including facial recognition systems, and monitoring of digital communications for targeted names and keywords. And each of these rests on assumptions about the validity of categorical modes of identification of persons and so-called patterns of life, as well as massive reliance on the assignment of guilt by association. In other words, these technical systems work through the amplification of what are actually quite primitive and crudely discriminatory and historically injurious ways of rendering the world as data. And as Jeff argues, the investment in these technologies is a continuation of the hegemonic imaginaries of perfect knowledge and rationality that Jeff names the global matrix of control. At the same time, as Jeff cautions and my work emphasizes, I think we need to maintain a strong skepticism and attend to the gaps between these aspirational fantasies and actual technical systems. So aspirations like those that are set out in the United States Joint All-Domain Command and Control Program, or in Israel's so-called Weapon Integrated Battle Management System, these arguably tell us as much, if not more, about persistent problems with the global matrix of control and the promise of techno solutions to those problems than they tell us about actual operational conditions of either the US or Israeli militaries. In particular, the promise of what Jeff summarizes as, in his words, precise full spectrum military capabilities able to respond quickly anywhere in the world. And that is a statement that you could read in so many of the doctrine documents that are coming out of the US military as well as the Israeli. That promise of this full spectrum capability remains unfulfilled, and that's really important. Moreover, what we're seeing in IDF operations in Gaza and now in the West Bank is that so-called precision targeting, which is one of the great claims for this data-driven warfighting, precision targeting isn't really the point, at least if we understand precision as assuring the legitimacy of targeting under international humanitarian law and the Geneva Conventions. The Israeli bombardment of Gaza has shifted the argument for AI-enabled targeting from claims for greater precision and accuracy to the objective of accelerating the rate of death and destruction. In a report by Abraham Yuval in Plus 972, IDF spokesperson Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari has confirmed that in the bombing of Gaza, in his words, quote, "the emphasis is on damage and not on accuracy," end quote. So for those who have been advancing precision and accuracy as this kind of high moral ground of data-driven targeting, this admission must surely be somewhat disruptive. It shifts the narrative from a technology in aid of adherence to IHL to automation in the name of industrial scale productivity and target generation, enabling greater speed and efficiency in killing. As Abraham's intelligence sources acknowledge, moreover, Israel's operations are not actually indiscriminate, but are deliberately designed to create shock among the civilian population under the premise that this will somehow contribute to Israel's aim of eliminating Hamas. So let me just say quickly some more specifics about the systems that are in use. And what we know about these systems for most of us comes from a series of articles in Plus 972 and Local Call, and reporting by Yuval Abraham on these two systems, as Jeff mentioned, one called Habzora, or the Gospel, and the other called Lavender, which are, again, as I said, systems designed to accelerate the procedures for target identification and so for killing. So the first report was published in November of 2023, and it draws on sources within the Israeli intelligence community who confirm to Abraham that IDF operations in the Gaza Strip combine more permissive authorization for the bombing of non-military targets with a loosening of constraints regarding expected civilian casualties. This policy sanctions in the sense of allows the bombing of built structures in densely populated civilian areas, including high-rise residential and public buildings that get designated as so-called power targets. And a direct corollary of that operational strategy is the need for an unbroken stream of candidate targets. And to meet that requirement, the Habzora system is designed to accelerate the generation of targets from surveillance data, creating what one of the intelligence officers quoted in the story's headline describes as, quotes, "a mass assassination factory." Now, official legal guidelines require that selected buildings must house a legitimate military target. And we always hear in IDF reports on their operations, there's always a citation of what would be a legitimate military target. So they should house a legitimate military target, and they should be empty of civilians at the time of their destruction. So the former has meant that there should be some rationale for a particular strike, even if it's not actually a significant military operation, while the latter has resulted, as we know, in the issuance of this constant and changing succession of increasingly unfeasible evacuation orders to those who are trapped in a diminishingly small areas of Gaza, now down to about 10% of the territory. Moreover, once Israel has basically declared that the entire surface of Gaza is a cover for Hamas tunnels, and all of those tunnels are then assumed to be legitimate military targets, the entire strip effectively becomes fair game for destruction. And as Chris Habels-Gray observes in a recent article published in the journal Technocultura, these assaults on civilian structures, including hospitals and schools, housing the injured and the displaced, are, he argues, acts of terrorism carried out in the name of counterterrorism. So the second story, which was published in April of this year, describes the system named Lavender, which is dedicated to the targeting of individuals now designated as suspected, quotes, low-level Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad militants, and deployed most intensively. These systems were deployed most intensively in the early days of the assault on Gaza following October 7th. So moving to the low level expands out from known specific senior operatives within Hamas to a much broader population. The training data for this system, Lavender, are based on features that are correlated with known Hamas or jihad fighters. So you take people who have been arguably proven to be fighters within Hamas or the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. But those features include things like people who are in a WhatsApp group with an identified militant, or people who change their cell phones every few months because that's part of the profile of a militant, or people who change their addresses frequently, which of course has become quite a meaningless criterion under the current circumstances. So all of the individuals in the population data set that's been built from the massive surveillance infrastructure of the occupied territories are then assigned a score between 1 and 100. And then based on those scores, the system marked some 37,000 people as probable militants and potential targets, and marked them in order of their priority. The machine-generated targets, we're told, were given only very cursory reviews. So one source explained that he would spend maybe 20 seconds to confirm that the individual was male, given the prohibition within Hamas and the PIJ against women fighters. And Abraham further describes a kind of horrendous cost-benefit calculus that plots the monetary value and availability of bombs, because of course, part of this is inventory control over your ordnance. So it plots the monetary cost and availability of bombs against the rating of the target. And that results in the use of so-called dumb bombs against those who are categorized as low-level militants. As C, one of the intelligence officers interviewed by Abraham, explains, quote, "You don't want to waste expensive bombs on unimportant people. It's very expensive for the country, and there's a shortage of those bombs. So while the cost of munitions goes down with the relative unimportance of the target, the levels of acceptable collateral damage go up, because that's the way dumb bombs work. And moreover, individuals are attacked not when they're in combat, which is technically should be the case under IHL, but when they return to their houses at night, with the result that entire families are killed along with the target, which is another clear violation of IHL. So just to sum up, the fallacy of precision in these systems, and this applies to these systems in operation in Israel, but to all of the data-driven warfighting systems that are being promoted within the US and Israeli military-industrial complex. This fallacy of precision actually makes them more rather than less deadly and indiscriminate. And in Gaza, we see mass destruction legitimized by claims for a form of mechanical objectivity. That is, the data are objectively derived. The targets are objectively derived from data, and yet it's based on a completely unaccountable system of datafication. We don't know how those data are made. We don't know anything about their validity. And so very far from the idea of ground truth or the gospel, these systems really rely on the objectification and digital dehumanization of Palestinian life. And the IHL distinction between those who are in and out of combat is rendered powerless by these practices. And I want to end with just some thoughts about that. Because as we know, on the 26th of January, the International Court of Justice ruled that the charge of genocide brought by South Africa was plausible and ordered Israel to ensure the protection of Palestinian civilians. Sadly, as we can see, the court's orders have had no force outside the court of public opinion. And at the same time, there is a growing body of critical voices, including inside Israel. We've seen that just over this weekend, who insist that only an immediate ceasefire and unconditional release of hostages can reopen the path to a political solution. And I hope maybe we can come back to this, because I would be very interested in what Jeff thinks about the actions in the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court. What meaning, what value do they have? So to end, let me just say I see, or I guess I'm most aware of and working within 3 areas of crucial intervention. So the first of these is really, I think, as both Jeff and I are doing, tracking the growing military commercial complex. So people like former Google engineer and now dissident journalist Jack Paulson has a project, his project of tech inquiry, which is tracking all of the networks of relations between persons and money within this complex. I've been following this succession from what was called the Defense Innovation Board, a group of experts to advise the Pentagon on the incorporation of AI into weapon systems, which then became the National Security Commission on AI, which effectively delivered a set of recommendations to Congress with pretty much the wording that could be translated directly into legislation, to the current Special Competitive Studies Project. In all of these expertise, those who are considered to be experts are, almost to the person, also those with the greatest conflicts of interest, because they are those engaged in promoting AI, military technophiles and venture capitalists like Robert Work and Eric Schmidt. While as Michael Brennis and William Hartung write in a post that I really recommend from the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, that's titled "Private Finance and the Quest to Remake Modern Warfare," they write, quote, "While the bulk of Pentagon funding still goes to the big 5 contractors, that's Lockheed Martin, RTX, which is formerly Raytheon, Boeing, General Dynamics, and Northrop Grumman, VC-backed startups aspire to become the future of military contracting, and they hope that AI and other emerging technologies will be their ticket." End of the quote. So rather than displace it, as they also explain, rather than displacing the entrenched arms industry, these new initiatives lead to further expansion of the Pentagon's already almost $1 trillion budget. And the surge in VC investment in emerging arms technology is being spearheaded by a handful of firms and individuals, and the connections between the US and Israel here are close. 2 of the most important players in the US are the Founders Fund. That's a venture capital fund started by Peter Thiel, founder of the arms technology firm Palantir, and Andreessen Horowitz, whose, quotes, American Dynamism Fund invests in emerging tech firms like Anduril and Shield AI. I think a second really important mode of intervention, as I said, is to identify the slippages between militarism's aspirations and actual practices. Some of that can come from reports in the defense media of the limits of new tech that are discovered in field exercises. Sometimes you get a nice quote from a disappointed or skeptical participant in those exercises. The failure of startups like Eric Schmidt's Rebellion Defense, which basically bet the future of the country on securing a contract for a, quote, tactical threat awareness tool that would leverage AI for battlefield operations. Investigative reporting, again, like that being done at Plus 972. New York Times journalist Asmat Khan's amazing civilian casualty files, which track the unaccountable killing in U.S. operations in Iraq and Syria, or Matthew Aiken's reporting in the Times of the last known missile strike by the U.S. in Kabul in 2021. All of these give you a glimpse into the slippage, the failures of these systems that you don't get from the kind of discourse that comes out of the Pentagon. And then finally, alliance with dissenters, including, I think, really importantly, veterans. So within Israel, breaking the silence, combatants for peace, and also activist tech workers, No Tech for Apartheid, and others. And Leonard Cohen, Canadian songwriter, reminds us in the lyrics to his song Anthem, he writes, "There is a crack in everything, and that's where the light gets in." So for me, while the apparatuses of militarism are pervasive, and Jeff's book makes that abundantly clear, their closure is never complete. So the question then is how the cracks that haunt the military machine can be amplified as a contribution to wider collective efforts to interrupt the operations of colonial violence and to expand the spaces for accountability, for reparation, and for justice. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Lucy. Jeff, I'll spotlight you as well. I think that should work. So yeah, I mean, if people in the room have questions, do feel free to raise your hands. I don't know if Lucy and Jeff, you wanted to pose a couple of questions first, and then we can broaden it out to the room.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to ask a question of Jeff if he's, because I'm wondering how, watching what's happening at the moment in Israel, Gaza, I'm wondering whether you feel that that is a continuation of what you've been seeing and the argument that you've been making, or do you feel that it is a kind of culmination, that things are reaching a kind of end stage in a way of what's been going on so far? And of course, what I'm thinking about is the sort of full expulsion of Palestinians from the territories.
Well, like I said, our framework, I think the proper framework for understanding Israel's behavior and policies and goals is settler colonialism. In other words, the idea is to Judaize Palestine, basically,
Yes.
turn Palestine into a Jewish country, and that implies, like I said, genocide. But Israel's in a situation where it can't get rid of all the Palestinians. It would love to, I mean, certainly not through genocide physically, but also through expulsion. It expelled half the Palestinian population, but it's stuck in a way with the other half. And so the only way out for Israel is really apartheid. And I think, so apartheid is already in place. You have Israel proper, so-called, which is always outside of the political discussion. I mean, everything politically discussed is the 22% of Palestine that's occupied. Israel is Israel, and it's accepted, and it's normalized, and we don't even go there. But then within that 22%, 60% of the 22% is called Area C, and that's where the settlements are. So that if you take what are called areas A and B, without getting into details, which are like 194 disconnected enclaves, and then you add Gaza, which has become uninhabitable, really, and that could have a population, not so much an expulsion from Gaza, but under the guise of humanitarian aid for refugees. Countries like Canada and the United States and Europe and Australia will take each one 50, 60, 70,000 poor Gazans, and in that way enable Israel to ethnically cleanse the Gaza Strip. So that it's a combination of trying to get Palestinians out, whether it's by making where they're living uninhabitable, or by inducing immigration as well, and then confining them to these islands that I mentioned on about 15% of historic Palestine, even though the Palestinians are half the population. So that apartheid is the only way out if genocide can't be completely done the way, in other words, you can't get rid of the population. And the reason I think today, just to get at your question directly, why there's such an upsurge, from this point of view, it is different in Gaza and the West Bank. And that is that Biden, in particular, the United States, has been pushing this process of normalization. It began really with Trump, even the Abrahamic Accords, and then before that as well, but Trump and into Biden. And the only way settler colonialism wins is by normalizing. First, it creates its colonial control, but then it normalizes it. And that's and it's interesting how the Biden administration has adopted this colonial vocabulary of normalization. What does that mean? That would mean then if Israel normalizes, especially with Saudi Arabia and the more moderate the Sunni world, that means then that Israel is not only accepted as Israel, but that its wider expansion into an apartheid system, its expansion onto 85% of Palestine, is accepted. Because nothing in the normalization, they talk about the two-state solution, but Biden is relying on the fact that nobody reads the fine print. So what does two states mean? So we'll take that Bantustan of these small little islands on 15% of historic Palestine. We'll give them a president like Abu Mazen. And we'll call it a Palestinian state. We'll upgrade the Palestinian Authority to a state. I mean, nobody's going to look, is this state really viable? Is it really sovereign? Nobody's going to get into those details. And now you got the two-state solution, which is really two-state apartheid, normalized with the wider Arab world and then with the international community, and Israel wins. So what's happening today is that Israel is basically mopping up. It's in a frantic process of disconnecting from Gaza, because Gaza is not a part of this, and at the same time, ethnically cleansing Area C, pushing Palestinians as much as possible to A and B, and even B is beginning to be constricted much more. Because as soon as the fighting dies down in Gaza, Biden has announced we're going back to the normalization process. That they're desperate to do that. And I think that is gives you the political context to why this tremendous surge of violence and repression and expulsion, both in Gaza but also in the West Bank. The West Bank is actually more important for Israel than Gaza.
Thanks.
I think we'll take some of the questions from the room. I think the first hand up was Bernadette's.
Hi, thanks, Patrick. Yeah, I'd like to ask a question mostly of Jeff, responding to your first comments, but also partly to a comment that Lucy made about acts of terrorism being akin or in the name of counterterrorism. And my question really goes to the naming of, Jeff, what you call conventional warfare. Now, I understand that to address this question is a bit like opening a kind of ideological cesspit. There's no, my intention is not really to argue about definitions of warfare, but really to ask you to respond to the huge amount of kind of theoretical thinking that has been done in the last 20 years around war being indistinguishable from peace. And so here I'm thinking of Badiou, of Agamben, of Zizek, of Ray Chow, of, a long line of these people who have said, and also novelists, of course. Somebody mentioned Eric Gregory, but, his Everywhere War is really following 1984, the idea that war is peace and peace is war, and the two are indistinguishable. So I wanted you to maybe comment on this idea that peace itself is a kind of coded war, and that maybe this is not something that has happened recently, but that actually in the argument of Neocleus, who you may not know, is a British writer, goes back to the 17th century, if not prior to that. The second question that I have is to do specifically with this term pacification, because it's often thought of or identified with the America-Vietnam War, was adopted in the 1960s as a kind of substitute term for counterinsurgency. But again, that term goes back to political discourse in the colonial wars of the 16th century, when Philip II had to reply to the discontent among his own people and the continuing violence in the colonies, and who said, okay, these are not wars, they're not conquests, they're pacifications. So I wonder, what value there is in continuing to bandy around the term war in light of these kind of very complicated histories, which are not often acknowledged in the conventional mainstream uses of the term war. And I guess the reason that I have been thinking a lot about this is, again, I'm not sure that I agree that the left has been oblivious to this kind of complexity. I mean, certainly from where I stand, I'm the convener of the Art and Politics MA at Goldsmiths, and artists are incredibly alert to the idea that pacification is as much about culture and ideology as it is about the use of military technology. And actually, these term pacification, or these conversations around soft power that we used to hear so much during Obama's regime, are still very influential in developing so-called alternative methods of dealing with everyday war, or the war that is peace, or the peace that is war. So I'm throwing out a few ideas. Feel free to pick any or all of them, but I'm interested in your response to this, because it seems from where I'm standing that we are all at war all the time. And the technologies of war that we like to think of as being deployed in Ukraine or elsewhere, we can buy drones in little supermarkets in the UK now. So facial recognition is an everyday technology in museums everywhere around the world. Food science used in the military-industrial complex is used in gymnasiums. The military-industrial complex, it seems to me, has completely penetrated everyday life. Again, coming back to this question about how we distinguish, or if we even should distinguish, between the idea of war and peace, whereby war is something exceptional.
Okay.
Sorry,
No,
that was a long one.
No, let me focus just on two things really quickly, and then I'll let Lucy respond as well. The idea of everywhere war is a military phrase as well. I mean, the military uses that, and I think one of the most telling terms that the military uses is battle space. We don't use anymore battlefields. That's, we used to fight wars in battlefields. They were contained. There were borders to the wars. There were clear enemies. There were parameters, including even legal parameters, but the kinds of weapons you used. And that's where terms like conventional warfare and so on, kind of captured a certain type of definable warfare. But once you move to battle space and everywhere war, then all those, like you say, all those terms kind of become irrelevant. It's not, there are no more borders. That's why I talk about securocratic wars, securocratic conflicts, or securocratic processes. It's not, they're not, the fact that, you take off your shoes at the airport is part of the securocratic system. It isn't targeting you, but it's yourself pacifying yourself. And so I think that if I can just go back for 1 second, Patrick, to the screen. And let me go back to what Rupert Smith says. Rupert is, is the general who coined the term war amongst the people, and he defines wars in a way, in the sense that you're talking about. He says the ends for which we're fighting. I'm kind of blocked out with this. See if I can get this sidebar. All right, anyway. The ends for which we fight are changing from the absolute objectives of interstate warfare to more malleable objectives having to do with the individual and societies that are not states. Okay, well, already all those borders and boundaries and so on that you talk about have been between war and peace are gone. They're malleable objectives, and they have to do with the individual and societies that aren't states, not necessarily in conflict situations, but in management, more of a management. And I think this is, in a sense, a key as well. Israel could easily conquer the Palestinians. It could easily, control them much more, not to mention kill them. But instead, it manages them. In other words, it wants them, in a sense, to stay, even though it forces an apartheid system, because, first of all, without them, you wouldn't have the laboratory. But beyond that, it's not just a laboratory of warfare, having to do with beating the other side and fighting terrorism and all of that, but it has to do with management. How do you manage? Because, the United States is not going to get rid of the whole young generation of middle-class people that are restive about living under a neoliberal system that they're excluded from. They're not going to wipe them out. The question is, how do we manage them? And that's where police forces again come in, and the whole securocratic idea comes in. And that's where, you're right, the whole idea of warfare simply changes completely any kind of, it's not even an appropriate word. He also says here that our conflicts, wait a minute here, my high-tech skills are coming into the fore here. He says that our conflicts tend to be timeless, since we are seeking a condition. This is really important. They're not seeking victory, which is the ultimate military term. Total, Netanyahu talks about total victory in Gaza. Even Gallant, his defense minister, said that's ridiculous. But not only that, you really don't, there is no such thing as total victory. There's a condition that you're trying to achieve, which can be maintained, which may take years or decades. So that, again, this is the kind of melding of warfare and securocratic control of people abroad and at home. So that's, in a sense, it's not getting too much into what you were saying, but well, I hopefully it related to what you were saying. But let me just say, if I can take one more second, maybe, and just, because you mentioned, because I think the key to this, as we try to talk about, is pacification. And let me put up a slide really quickly, because I tried to define what that means. It's a key word that we don't use very often, actually, in the left. But I think this is the whole purpose of it. And so when Lucy's talking about how algorithms and all these data-driven military systems are defining targets and defining who the enemy is and so on, again, as she emphasizes and I emphasize, it's the purpose and the that is behind the setting of the parameters of the algorithms. And the purpose here is pacification. This is the purpose, I think, of neoliberalism. It isn't victory. It isn't genocide. It isn't, in all those, it's pacification because it's trying to create a condition that can be maintained for forever, basically, one in which an unsustainable system of inequality and oppression and climate destruction and so on can be somehow sustained partly in a militarized way. And so pacification, if you just look at this, is a global project of fabricating a social order conducive to capitalist accumulation. Pacification is a form of governmentality that suppresses opposition to a point where resistance is impossible. And to get back to Patrick's thing in the beginning, when we begin to think about resistance and countermeasures to this whole kind of an all-encompassing system that we're talking about here, a militarized neocultural system, the question is, this is aspirational, as Lucy says, to get to a point where resistance is impossible. And so we have to really exploit and identify those cracks that Lucy talks about so we don't get to the point where actual pacification is taking place. Pacification secures the insecurity of capitalism, especially as it declines. And finally, pacification requires that the authorities know everything in a security state. There are no unexceptional spaces, or spaces of anonymity. So this is where it begins to shade into policing and surveillance and that kind of securocratic. So that, I think this begins to get at what you're talking about. All right, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, thanks. I'm just going to respond briefly because I see there are other hands up, but I guess I want to resist a bit the equation, the collapse of the distinction between peace and war is very provocative and has a whole lot of truth to it. And yet I would want to hold on to claiming it or insisting upon some differences that matter. All of the spaces within both sides of that, the spaces within what we would call about as peace, which the kind of heterogeneity of the possibilities there, and similarly for war. So I'm not prepared to just accept the statement that there is no longer a difference between peace and war. But I actually talk about militarism because I think that's really what we're in engagement with here. And again, the idea that we're all at war all the time. Well, yes, of course, there's some truth in that. We're all implicated, but we are all also not that way in the same way at all, right? Some of us are at war in much more material ways than others. So again, I want to hold on to the differences inside of these things. And also perhaps the difference between pacification and peacemaking. Again, not to sort of idealize peacemaking. There's plenty of room for critique of what goes on under the name of peacemaking. But I think holding on to the possibilities for peacemaking as acts of resistance is really crucial. And so, I think I always feel caught between the power of articulations that really sort of speak to the big picture, pull everything together. And of course, militaries are experts at that, as Jeff has just shown, sort of caught between that, which is very important, very powerful, but also resisting that, because I think that is more part of the problem than the solution.
May I just very, very briefly respond to that, Patrick, with apologies for anyone waiting. I asked this question from a very specific perspective as an Irish person, and therefore as someone who is alert to the fact that who gets to name a war as war is partly the issue. So it's less to do with there being no differences between war and peace, and more to do with how the social order is determined and to what extent a warlike or a state of war can become a permanent feature of the social order. So, as you know,
Yes.
in the case of Northern Ireland, the Troubles were not called a war other than by people who were living through them. They were, in fact, a clandestine war, which were followed, with military strategies planned out by Frank Kitson, for instance, who experimented in colonized British countries in Africa. And so this feature of kind of colonial experimentation seems to kind of arise continually in these discussions about what characterizes war and who gets to determine whether it is war or not. And that was why I was so interested in what you said, Lucy, as well, about acts of terrorism being described as counterterrorism. And I guess, I'm not trying to say that the experience of what we call war is the same as the experience of those who are perceived as being in so-called peaceful countries, but that those of us who think we live in very peaceful countries are in fact active in contributing to a military-industrial complex, and that we need to be aware of that.
Absolutely, I completely agree with that, and I also resist using the word war to refer to what's going on in Israel, Gaza. It is in the U.S. media; it's referred to as the war. This is not a war. This is mass killing. Yeah, no, but I very much agree with what you said.
Thank you very much, and thanks for indulging me with my second question.
Thanks, Bernadette. We've got about 5 minutes left. I mean, if it's okay with Lucy and Jeff, maybe to run over another 5 minutes or so, we can get to these 3 questions that we have waiting. Tracy, I think you were next. If you're able to connect.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, you are. Okay.
Thanks.
Great.
Hi. Thanks for this great talk. I have a quick comment and then I have a question. I think both are kind of underpinned by desperation. But if we look at Lucy, you talked about the kind of connections between AI, like this kind of data-driven warfare. A place where I see a really troubling intersection is in education and higher education, and like universities tripping over themselves wanting to invest in this stuff, and with this kind of belief that a person's intent can somehow make AI good, that AI could be, if only we could make AI work for us, the humans, right? And like I feel like that melty face often, that emoji in these meetings, because like somehow I'm that only person being like, but so anyways, I just see there's like and I see, I'm also from Canada, and I see that the Canadian government seems to hide a lot of their kind of connections with the military industrial complex with Israel under the term of research. You go to the Canadian government site and there's a lot of research programs in between Canada and Israel. Okay, so that's my comment. My very quick question, which probably is not quickly answered, is my research, my PhD research was on aerial perspectives of landscape. So when we talk about the worldview rendered into quantitative data, that hits me. That's what I spend a lot of time on. Where I'm really troubled these days is what is happening to qualitative data, and in particular photographs, right, that seem to be getting drained of a kind of evidentiary status. Like we see all these images coming out of Gaza, for example, and they kind of become neutralized on platform. I don't know. I really don't know. Like forensic architecture has been very pivotal to my research and teaching, but I stand before my students and I don't honestly know what to say anymore about this. And I wonder if, if you can help me. That's about it. Thanks.
Yeah, well, you've raised such an important and difficult question. And all I can say is that I think this is another place where we have to go back to the relations of production. That images, we have to know the provenance of images. We have to know their, of course, authorship can become complex. That doesn't then mean that we abandon it, right? And so if images, if any forms of witnessing are to continue to have evidentiary status, then I think we have to teach a kind of critical technical literacy that emphasizes provenance as the most important thing about anything that you read, that you see, and then we can explore, okay, what does provenance mean? What do we mean by that? But that should become the project, I think.
Thank you, Tracy. Okay, so I think, Lily, you had your hand up, but I think you have to possibly leave. So I don't know if you've got time to quickly ask a question.
Oh, thank you. I think Ebru might have been before me, but I do have to go. I mean, so yeah, I wouldn't mind. Thank you. That's very generous. Okay. Hi, thank you for this really depressing but important discussion. Yeah, the kind of ideas about surplus humanity and the climate crisis, and like this is only going to become more important. Like, I totally agree with that. And Jeff, I did not know about your books, so now I'm going to definitely go read them. My apologies, trained as an informatics person, because like I live at the border of US and Mexico. And so like, it's like literally everyday life, like manufactured crises for security theater for the Midwestern United States voter. The question was, I was thinking about this notion, this like idea about the cracks that Lucy was talking about, like not ceding perfection to the AI. And it seems to me like the kind of imperfection of these technologies, like because of the surplus population thing, like actually just, it's like a feature, not a bug. Like, okay, you kill more people, there's collateral damage. And so I was trying to think like, what are the cracks that matter? And what are the cracks that like, just further the operations of the settler colonial securitizing system. So like one, just to throw some like initial, not answers, but just to like clarify what I mean. So like Piven and Cloward have this book, Poor People's Movements, and they're asking like, why is it that there are certain moments where massive structural change can happen when a lot of times poor people's movements are very resource intensive and fizzle out. And they identify moments where movements were able to exploit dissensus within the ruling class. So the crack is like not so much in the algorithm, but in the coalition that's upholding the settler state, or maybe with software, the utility of these cracks is like pointing ways of evading the technologies or hacking the technologies, like finding exploits and hacks. Are there other cracks that matter? And are there cracks that don't? Just question to both of you.
Yeah, that's a great question. And of course, identifying cracks, identifying spaces where things don't quite fit, where the narrative isn't quite as the reality isn't quite as coherent as the narrative would suggest. That's not inherently emancipatory, right? I mean, it's a matter of, and similarly, as you said, if I think one of the most amazing revelations about Israel's use of these data-driven targeting systems is that the admission that the cracks don't matter. We could say that, yeah, of course, these are deeply flawed, but we need some kind of arguably rational basis for accelerating our targeting. But I think we can continue to pursue the cracks within that, right? And that's where we go back to the data that drives those systems, the assumptions that inform those data. And so I think all of those spaces matter. And then the question is, how are we positioned in relation to them? And what kind of opportunity do they afford for intervention, right? So, but I think that it's to try to resist the kind of, succumbing to the kind of depression that you mentioned at the beginning, by holding on to those gaps, right, where the light comes in, as Cohen says, in coalition with other people, and so yeah, I hope that helps. And you have a postscript, I see.
Yeah, just like a quick question then. Is like, I guess like one worry I have is like identifying the gaps. Usually, like I feel like my mind and going like, well, the data doesn't mean what you think it means, or these the targeting, like it's easy for the next step in the argument with like the imagined interlocutor here, or the real interlocutor, to be, oh, well, we can make it better and we'll find the real terrorist then. And so that's where I've just kind of become like an abolitionist. And then I'm like, all right, well, like, how do we, I don't know what abolition exactly means in the context of Palestine, but I feel like in like where I live, it's become very clear that criticizing the police doesn't work unless like we have these like alternatives, and we have like other forms of community that make people less susceptible to the fear-based politics that like, makes them consent to the securitization you're talking about. But yeah, other spaces where you feel like the cracks don't lead to, we'll find the right real terrorist.
I want to I know we're getting close to the end. I just want to emphasize that my intent was not to depress anybody. And it was
kind of a joke. I'm sorry.
No, but
don't get derailed by that.
Because sometimes in our present, I try to present. Maybe I presented too starkly, but I'm trying to really set up what exactly we're confronting here. And the downside of that strategy is that you impart a sense of totalization. It's the same with neoliberalism, that it's a totalizing system. There's nothing to do about it. They have the technology. They're pacifying us. And that's certainly not the case. I'm trying to set this up so that we know the enemy. We know exactly what we're facing. We begin to know in this area, at least, what these systems are, what the intentions are, what the actors are, and so on, so that we can identify those cracks and develop strategies for dealing with them. Because you just can't, that's why it's so important to get to know this kind of a field. The weakness of the left that we all know is that we're all siloed. So that in a sense, I think all the different struggles, whether it's, climate change, or, the anti-war movement, or the third world debt, the women's movement, the LGBTQ movement, the movement of the landless peasants. I mean, there's all kinds of movements, and they've all identified cracks. They all have strategies. They all have actions because they know the area that they're dealing with. But because of the siloing, we're not sharing that very much. And so I think a lot more work has been done a lot more strategy, a lot more analysis has been done than we're aware of, but we're not sharing it very much. And I think this area that we're talking about, the whole military-industrial complex and securitization, is one of the less known areas. And maybe because it's one reason why the left hasn't dealt with it much, is because it does get very technical. And so just to say that I think one of the issues that we're facing here, and I've been trying to organize around that, but it's hard, is a real disconnect between analysts, academics, and people in think tanks, and people in research institutes that really have that knowledge, and the activists or the militants or the people that are out there trying to find strategies and ways of organizing to exploit the cracks. And I think that to expect the activists find the cracks and develop strategies maybe isn't the best strategy. I think the best would be if we had some kind of a system that we don't have, in which the academic knowledge that's produced, that's there, the critical academic knowledge about all these systems, including the military systems, can somehow be translated and shared with the people on the ground. And then together we begin to build that kind of a strategy. They have to help us identify the cracks, and then we have to begin to organize in order to address them. And I think that whole, I don't believe in movements, to tell you the truth. I don't think movements, they're ephemeral. There's no follow-up. There's no real leadership. There's no program. I really believe in the old organizing. And I think in the old organizing, this disconnect between the academic analytical world that exists and the world of the people out there trying to change things and exploit the cracks is a real flaw, is a kind of a fatal flaw in our attempts to try to organize against this.
I want to hear from Ebru, but just to say that I think that is happening. There are examples of those kinds of coalitions, and I think I agree they're incredibly important.
Ebru, please.
Yes, thank you very much. I will be very fast, promise. Thank you, Lucy and Jeff, for your significant and great work and contribution. My question is regarding the deployment of these AI technologies, because since a long time, there's this global concern that we will achieve a point in time where these semi-autonomous technologies will turn into fully automized technology, where there's no human supervision anymore. And in the current case in Gaza, we have newly introduced AI technologies like the Lavender, as you have explained, Lucy. And when you take a look at the providers of these systems, those ones who develop these systems, like the IDF military, they have their own specific unit. And then we have other companies, Israeli-based companies and other international ones. They all claim that there is some sort of semi-autonomism in these technologies where there is always a human supervision. I believe that this is an important point. So in order not to violate any international law, but then when you read certain reports by whistleblowers, for example, people that used to work for the IDF or who are still working at the IDF, they said that there was more or less barely any supervision in certain AI technologies. One commander maybe had like 5 seconds in order to check a list with, I don't know, hundreds of targets. So when we talk about the ethical implications of these technologies, particularly about accountability and transparency, I do not really see these ethical implications being given in this context. So my question would be to the both of you, do you believe that we have already entered that area where we are having these type of fully autonomous weapons already used? And my second question would be, what type of approach should we take on this blind spot? If there would be any strategy or any approach that could be done, since we do not have that full transparency in this context. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, I've done work with the campaign to stop killer robots on the campaigns for prohibitive treaties on autonomous weapon systems, and I think that I see autonomy as really about progressive automation, and I think holding on to the idea of automation is really important here. So that's one thing. So and within the context of the discussions at the UN and so forth, the idea of meaningful human control has been emphasized to render these kind of completely pro forma claims to supervision inadequate. But I guess for me, the bigger problem is the human in that. I think it decontextualizes the politics and the economics of these systems, and that what we really are looking at is increasing automation automation that closes down space for deliberation, for de-escalation, for judgment. And that is a continuum of, in the automation of weapon systems over a long period of time. And so I think that's what needs to be interrupted with the question of whether we're at fully autonomous weapons. Yes, that's a concern, but the real problem is automation here and its effects on further accelerating the speed of warfighting. So that's where I would sort of put the emphasis.
Thank you.
Let me say just one word, and then and that is that I mean, there's a lot to say about the issue of accountability, but if you learn from Israel and what is happening in Gaza, certainly what settler colonialism does, but also what all these larger systems do that are engaging in wars against the people, is that they criminalize. That was that one slide that I tried to put up at the beginning, where we all become the enemy. It's the universal adversary. And I think that where Israel, in a way, makes its case, I mean, it tries to argue that it's working within IHL and all of that, but it criminalizes the Palestinians. You see, they're terrorists. And once you're a terrorist, I mean, you talk about digital dehumanization. This is in a way a political dehumanization. Terrorists are terrorists, and they're bad, and there's nothing, you can't protect them, you can't explain them, you can't, even give, you have to simply defend yourself any way you can against them. So the minute you're able to criminalize the population, that in a sense takes care of the accountability issue. Look, it's not our problem. We're defending ourselves. You see, that's Israel's language all the time. We're defending ourselves. And so the Palestinians, Edward Said had an interesting phrase. He called the Palestinians the victims of the victims. Because if those that are conducting the war, Israel, or the neoliberal powers that be, whatever the form of warfare, the securocratic warfare is, and you're able to criminalize and make the ones you're fighting not the enemy but the universal adversary, this insecurity that's built into everything, then in a way you don't have to be accountable. You're protecting the system. And so you become the victim. Here's where you get another kind of a turnaround where the perpetrator becomes the victim. The powerful becomes the powerless in a sense. And if Israel can do that that's where they're the victims of the victims, because their crime, the Palestinians' crime, is they're attacking the history's ultimate victims, that are the Jews. I mean, you're attacking people that just went through a Holocaust, you see. And so in a way, by framing things and using those terminologies, I think the terminologies are not just cracks, but they're areas that we have to really focus on, because this is what in a way holds this whole thing rationally together for most people, the vocabulary. Then in a sense, doing what we're doing in Gaza is accountable. It is good. We're simply and that's what Kamala Harris and Biden say all the time. Israel has a right to defend itself. So it becomes a very, very complicated manipulation of international law and language and so on, that I think has to really also be at the focus of our attention.
Well, thanks both to Lucy and Jeff for a really, I think, a great pair of talks and a really great conversation as well. And thanks everyone for coming along. We're a little bit over time now, and I appreciate you all for sticking with it for a little bit longer. And thanks so much to Lucy and Jeff.
Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you, Patrick. Yes.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
For the opportunity.
For doing it with.
Yeah.
No worries. And yeah, let's not let this be the end of the conversation. I'll be in touch with you both. All right.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay.
Thanks so
Bye-bye.
much, and thank you, everyone. Bye.